Welcome to the Young List. This is another single fragrance dedicated video because this particular fragrance, Abbé Rouge by Guerlain, is pretty important and I feel like it deserves a video of its own. Now, I've said before in other videos that there are certain fragrances, no matter how much I love them, I can't talk at length about them because there just isn't enough information. There's just not enough to really say beyond what the fragrance smells like, who made it, when it was released, all that fun stuff. But in the case of Abbé Rouge, pretty significant fragrance. It was Guerlain's first true flagship men's release. Not to say that it's the first men's release period, because back in 1904, they launched Mouchoir de Monsieur, although that was considered a private stock fragrance for basically half a century. It was originally made as a gift, if you remember my video when I talked about that. And then it was created in quantity because you can't make small amounts of perfume really like that. So the flacons were stored at the boutique in Paris, and if you knew about it, you could ask to have a bottle filled with it. It was a common practice for a lot of really old perfume houses in France to have fountains or flacons. Caron called them fountains. And you basically went in and you bought a bottle somewhere, either from there or from somewhere else. And then you bought the perfume loose. And they would charge you for how much they gave you. That was how you had to buy Mouchoir de Monsieur, because it wasn't like an official release, you know. And the reason is simple. There really wasn't a men's fragrance market back in 1904. And Guerlain was kind of, you know, stuck in their ways, being an old house. And they didn't see the need to make separate man's fragrances. That fragrance existed only on virtue of being a gift for a friend of the family. Fast forward to the 50s and all that would change. Suddenly you had a men's fragrance market and Guerlain was kind of caught flat-footed. So they decided to bottle Mouchoir de Monsieur and release it to the public. However, the fougere style was kind of long in the tooth by the 1950s. Fougères themselves had kind of gone down market. Jean-Paul Guerlain himself has gone on record as to saying that he thinks fougères smell like truck stops. So it wasn't really a good look for Guerlain to release a fougere like that to the market. It wasn't a very highbrow kind of scent. And thus, in 1961, we would see Guerlain Vetiver, one of two fragrances made by Jean-Paul Guerlain, the other one being Chanteau Rome, a couple years later in '63. But Guerlain Vetiver was his first solo fragrance, and it was made, again, as a sort of response to changes in the market. Carvin released the first Western market commercial vetiver fragrance. That was followed by Givenchy in 1959. And of course, Guerlain tested a vetiver fragrance in '59 in South America. And then by '61, they would launch that to the world as well. But vetiver was a vetiver, right? It was not a full, complex, full-bodied fragrance. Some of you may disagree with me on that, and that's fine. But it is a single subject fragrance. That is what it is, like a rose fragrance, like a sandalwood fragrance. So they still had yet to create a true, complex, abstract fragrance that was purpose-built for the men's market. That wasn't Mouchoir de Monsieur, created decades before as a gift to a friend, like I said. And thus, we would see the launch of Abbé Rouge in 1965. What's funny about Abbé Rouge is the fact that it's based around a very hoity-toity, high-class kind of sport that most of us blue-collar, red-blooded people don't even know about. Dressing. Dressing. I don't mean what you put on a salad either, or putting clothes on. I mean dressing the sport. It relates to horses. Breeding horses and showing off horses and making them do things like prance and look pretty and be all fancy. And there's usually somebody in a red jacket with a baton that's leading the horse, which is where the fragrance Abbé Rouge gets its name from. It's a red riding jacket. You know, usually the guy riding the horse being dressed is wearing the Abbé Rouge. Now, that doesn't really relate to us common folk at all, but the fragrance itself is arguably the more important thing. So you have to understand the nature of the men's fragrance market in the 50s and early 60s. Very conservative. Guys wanted dry, they wanted discreet, they didn't want a lot of sillage, they didn't want a lot of projection, they didn't want big musky notes, they didn't want a whole lot of anything that could really make them smell perfumey. So a lot of those early men's market fragrances from the late 40s on up until about the mid 60s, they were exercises in strict, dry, woody aromatics, bergamot, oak moss, things like that. There was a musk factor. The musk was very sour, or meant to be more of a wrinkle your nose, kind of an unpleasant thing, because masculine, it's supposed to be manly. And thus we would see things like Moustache by Rouge in 49. We would see Eau de Hermes in 51, although that was technically unisex fragrance. Then we would see stuff like Chanel Pour Monsieur in 55, also called Chanel for Men. And then Monsieur de Givenchy in 59, and that would lead on to Monsieur Lanvin in 64. And then here comes 1965, and we've got Abbé Rouge by Guerlain. They stuck with the citrus aromatic sheep formula, but they made it fancy because it's Guerlain, so it has to be fancy. Thus, you don't get one or two citrus notes, you get all the citrus. You get lemon, you get lime, you get tangerine, you get orange, okay? You get bergamot, all of them. And then, of course, you get some dandy-ish floral notes. You get rose, you get a little bit of jasmine, you get carnation. Men loved carnation back then. Now, the X factor for this fragrance, what makes it special, is the oriental notes that are in the fragrance. Abbé Rouge was famous among the perfume community and the industry, perfumers, for introducing a lot of semi-oriental tones to the citrus aromatic sheep. Later we would see those same tones appear in fougères like Pierre Cardin Pour Monsieur, so on and so forth. But this is a very transparent, light, fresh, woody sheep fragrance that has things like amber, sandalwood, vanilla, benzoin, tacked on to the structure, which makes it feel a little bit more musky, a little bit sweeter, a little richer than what you might expect from something like Monsieur de Givenchy or Chanel for Men. So that was pretty fancy. It was gussied up. It was kind of like a men's Shalimar, especially with the vanilla present. Now, I don't really get the Shalimar connection myself all that much, but I can see where people would say, okay, yeah, this kind of has a bit of a Shalimar vibe. Now, since we are still in that period where guys wanted very discreet fragrances, the original Abbé Rouge was a cologne. And I have an example of that. This is a 1976 bottle, but it's still the original formula for all intents and purposes. And here it is. Abbé Rouge Spray Cologne by Guerlain. Now, this compared to the eventual Eau de Toilette that would release in 1988. Here's an example of that. This is not a 1988 bottle, though, but this is the format. This particular format with the Listerine bottle was actually introduced with a gold cap. And once this bottle format came out in 1988, then Derby and Vetiver and a host of other fragrances all jumped into this bottle. With the exception of Heritage. Heritage had its own bottle for a number of years, as you might remember. Then it too eventually went into this bottle. But this silver cap is the second version of the fragrance, launched in early 2000s. Then by the 2010s, the silver cap was replaced with a label matching wood cap. So Vetiver had a green, this has a red wood cap. And then of course, now we have all of the man's fragrances sharing the same bottle as L'Homme Ideal. So the L'Homme Ideal bottles by Guerlain, those square bottles, now Heritage, Vetiver, Abbé Rouge, all come in those bottles. These Listerine bottles are gone now. When this came out in '88, it was because the market was moving in a direction where men wanted more powerful fragrances, and this is every bit of a cologne. So it is light, it is fresh. You get a lot of sillage in the first 30 minutes to an hour, and then after that it kind of tapers off, and you're probably going to maybe get 6 out of this, which is longer than 4711, okay? Longer than Farina, but still not like the kind of mileage that a man in 1988 would expect from a fragrance. Back then, he would want something that he could, fill an office with, or fill a dance club or his car, with scent. And you're not doing that with the original version of Abbé Rouge. Funnily enough, they were so unsure about the fragrance and how it would sell, with conventional male tastes being what they were in 1965, that they even released a dry version of Abbé Rouge. It's just called Abbé Rouge Eau de Cologne Dry. And what separates that fragrance from the standard cologne is just the lack of vanilla. There's a little bit of vanilla in there because there has to be, or the thing would just smell like sharp moss and wood and pain. So there's a little bit of rounding agent in there with the benzoin, but for the most part, the vanilla note is struck out of the dry version. You're going to get more of the citrus. The rosewood will become more prominent. But overall, the composition is a very complex push and pull. So the citrus aromatics, you know, all the various citruses up top, leading into the heart of the rose, jasmine, carnation. For every thick and rich oriental element added, there was something to counter it. So for the sandalwood, there was cedarwood. For the benzoin, there was a soapy rosewood note, okay? For the vanilla, there's orris, all right? For the patchouli, there's oak moss. So for each yin, there's a yang. And it's a very built-out composition for that reason, very complex. The kind of complex composition that you probably won't see again. There's even a leather note in here. I don't know what's being supported by. It's definitely not Castoreum. Maybe it's isobutylquinoline. But there's a leather note in here, and there's also a tiny drop of civet, because of course there's civet. Guerlain loves their civet. They have civet and Shalimar, civet and Jicky, civet and Mouchoir de Monsieur. Don't have civet and Mitsoko, to my knowledge. Could be in there, but they love their civet, so very much you can expect a little tiny judicious pinch of civet in the eau de cologne and in the eau de toilette. So the big difference between this one and the eau de cologne is the eau de cologne is definitely drier. Now, I'm not talking about the eau de cologne dry. I'm talking about the standard eau de cologne is still drier than this. When we moved into this, by 1988, we saw a slight uptick in the amber note, a slight uptick in the vanilla, in the benzoin. So this is going to smell sweeter and, you know, more oriental. And there's also, by the way, in both of these fragrances, there's a tiny dollop of Guerlain, okay? And those of you who don't know what Guerlain is a 1925 fragrance that was released alongside the full release of Shalimar, actually. But Guerlain would become a house note. The entire perfume that is Guerlain would be microdosed in every subsequent perfume that Guerlain made, starting with Nahima and working its way on up. So some things in the 40s, okay, and 30s might have had Guerlain in them too. I haven't smelled stuff like Jetty and things of that nature. Vol de Nuit actually has some Guerlain in it. That came out a little bit after Shalimar, so that has it as well. But that Guerlain note is a whole perfume in and of itself. That is effectively a perfume within a perfume, and it is dosed in basically every subsequent Guerlain composition after the Guerlain perfume itself was discontinued. It became a signature. It's one of those Where's Waldo? You have to try and spot it in a fragrance. Particularly old Guerlain fragrances like Le Hair Bleu will not have it though, because they predate Guerlain actually. They might have some semblance of Guerlain because they'll share some of the notes with it, but in its entirety they won't possess it. So aside from that Guerlain and the strange you know, infusion of the sandalwood, amber, orris, and vanilla notes, Abbey Rouge is, for the most part, a citrus aromatic sheep. Like I said, just a very fancy, gussied up one. The market didn't really know what to make of this back in '65 because of how put on airs it kind of was. So it was kind of a slow burn. You know, it wasn't a fragrance that really sold well right away. It had a very similar fate as some other fragrances I mentioned, like Givenchy Gentleman took about a decade to really find its stride. Same with Acqua di Gio by Giorgio Armani, wasn't an overnight success. These days, we don't see that. Nowadays, I ain't gotta tell you, you already know. If a fragrance doesn't sell like gangbusters in like the first 6 months, not even like the first 6 weeks, if they don't completely sell out of a fragrance immediately, it's discontinued by the end of the year. It's like, it's very live by the sword, die by the blade now. It's the short-term, profit-mongering corporate ghouls. Don't allow perfumes to find their market. Don't allow perfumes to grow legs and walk somewhere. You know, it's very much bang it out by Friday. So something like Abbey Rouge couldn't happen today because the market wouldn't allow it. Guerlain couldn't really do a fragrance this experimental and this weird and then expect it to eventually word of mouth spread and grow and slowly catch on. You know, it just wouldn't happen now. So besides the eau de toilette version, which ostensibly replaced the eau de cologne, there was also an eau de parfum created in 2003. By that point, Jean-Paul Guerlain was already kicked out. You know, Guerlain became an LVMH property, you know, no longer owned by the family. But he was brought back periodically to do some fragrances, like he did Coriolan and a handful of things in the 2000s. One of those things was the eau de parfum flanker. Then he would come back in 2008 and do a parfum edition. And the parfum would be limited to, again, the Paris boutique. You've got to go there and ask for it. You don't have to buy it in drams. It actually comes bottled, but it's one of those, you know, if you know kind of fragrances. And if you see it sold online, it's going to be super expensive because somebody had to buy it at the boutique and then stick it on an airplane or whatever, or try and mule it into the gray market somehow. So it's very hard to come by. I haven't smelled the eau de parfum or parfum as of this video, but if I do, I might do later videos discussing them. I'm not going to go back and redo this one because I just don't care enough. I feel like my life is complete with the eau de toilette and the original eau de cologne. I'm satisfied. And there's also a litany of flankers too that I must discuss, although I don't really know what they smell like either because I haven't really tried to get them, since most of them are also limited edition and they came out and they were gone within a year. So there is the low flanker, which is a fresh flanker. There are a handful of special editions like the dress code, which had several different versions. There was also an elixir. The most recent version is the elixir. I think it's called Elixir Privé, I believe. It could be wrong on that, but it's a super duper heavy concentrated, more concentrated than the parfum, I guess. And it comes in that L'Homme Ideal bottle I mentioned, that square bottle. All of the previous flankers came in this bottle. And any version of Abbé Rouge that is not a concentration, so the cologne, the toilette, the eau de parfum, the parfum, any other version of Abbé Rouge is not created by Jean-Paul Guerlain. It is made by Thierry Vasseur or one of the other people that work currently in the Guerlain laboratories, which is all LVMH now. And of course, one last thing I need to mention is I'm a bit disappointed with the market direction that Guerlain has taken. They've been owned by LVMH for years, but now they're starting to really do some shady things. In this case, they're rewriting their own history. And they're saying that Abbé Rouge was the first Western fragrance to contain oud, that it had oud in it, you know, a precious wood material, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and Jean-Paul Guerlain included it in Abbé Rouge back in 1965. Well, guess what? I've got a surviving bottle from that period, and there is no oud in this. There is no oud in this. So there might be some kind of oud molecule in the modern parfum or whatever they're selling these days, or the elixir, privé, whatever that is. But there was never oud in this fragrance to begin with. Even if they're now going back and retroactively adding it to the eau de toilette, because the cologne is gone. So if they're retroactively adding it to the toilette or the eau de parfum, that's a shame. Because it's not there, it's never meant to be there, it's not there. So they're pushing this narrative and rewriting their own history, and I just don't like that. So at that point, all I can say is if there are oud notes, or if there is oud in these newer versions of Abbé Rouge, it's caveat emptor at that point. It's buyer beware. I don't know. I haven't smelled that. I can't speak on that. And if that's your experience wearing modern Abbé Rouge, then we are talking about two entirely different fragrances, you and I. All right? I hope it isn't the case. But yeah, I read that on the Guerlain website, and I was kind of like stricken. I'm like, there's not oud in this fragrance. I mean, there's amber in this, yes, but oud, no. So, all right, guys, that's it. That's my video on Abbé Rouge. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learned something, and this has been the On List. Goodbye.